Chapter 7. Tov Shem Mishemen Tov, Yom HaMavet Miyom Hivaldo. A good name, better than good oil. I have to be careful about translations because translations will often be biased by commentaries, and we're trying to be as we're going to take it in a different direction. So I'm going to try to translate on my own, but the translation here at least will help you. A good name, better than good oil. Yom HaMavet Miyom Hivaldo. And the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Tov lelechat bet evel milechat bet mishteh b'asher hu sof kol ha'adam ve'achai yiten libo. It's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for that is the end of every man, and the living take it to heart. Ve'achai yiten libo. Tov ka'as mischok. Anger is better than laughter, or sorrow is better than laughter. Depends how you translate. Ki bero hapanim yitav lev, for by the sadness of the face, the heart is made good. Lev chachamim bevet evel, v'lev ksilim bevet simcha. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The heart of the fool is in the house of mirth. Tov lishmoa ga'arat chacham meish shomea shir ksilim. Better to listen to the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear songs of fools. Ki kekol hasirim tachat asir ken schok haksil v'gam ze hevel. A lot of alliteration going on in that text. As the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. In the English, you don't get the alliteration. I'm sorry. Kol hasirim tachat asir ken schok haksil v'gam ze hevel. Ki haoshek yolel chacham, extortion surely makes the wise man foolish. V'abed et lev matana, and bribe destroys understanding. Tov acharit davar mereshito, better is the end of a thing than its beginning. Tov erech ruach mikvar ruach, better is the patient in spirit than the proud in spirit. Al tevel beruchacha lichos, don't be hasty in your anger to be angry. Ki ka'as v'chek silim inuach, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Don't say, oh, the good old days. Why the former days are better than these? That's not a question of the wise. Wisdom is good with inheritance, but the advantage is to one who sees the sun. Kasef, wisdom is a defense, money is a defense, a shade, protection. But yitron da'at, but better is knowledge, because wisdom preserves the life of one who has it. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight that which he has made crooked? In a good day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. God has made one and the other. To the end that man cannot find anything after him. All of this I have seen in the days of my vanity. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness. There is a wicked man who lives long in his evil doing. Don't be so righteous. Don't destroy yourself. Don't become overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Don't be so wicked. Don't be so foolish. Why should you die prematurely? Good that you take a little bit of this and take a little bit of that. The one who fears God will come forth from all of them. Wisdom is the stronghold of the wise. Wisdom is greater protection, greater strength for the wise than 10 warriors in the city. There is no righteous man on earth who does good and does not sin. Don't heed to all the words that are spoken, lest you hear your servant curse you. For you know in your heart that you yourself have also cursed others. I'm just going to read a little bit more. All of this I have tested in wisdom. Amarti echkama. I said I will be wise. But it is far from me. That which is far off is exceedingly deep. Who can find it? I sought to seek understanding and wisdom, and to understand the wickedness and understand the way of the scheming of things, and to know that wickedness is stupidity and foolishness is madness. But what did I discover? In all of this, I found my conclusion that death, that woman is more bitter than death. I could close up shop right there, and we could all go home, and that would be the last class I ever teach. Her hands, her heart is snares and traps, her hands are chains. Whoever pleases God should escape from her, when the sinner shall be snared by her. But this I have found, says Kohelet. Adding one to another and taking it all into account. Adam echad me'elef matzati, v'isha b'chol elo lo matzati. 1 man in 1,000 I found. A woman in all of these I have not found. Levad zeh matzati. But this I found. Asher asa Elokim et Adam yashar. V'heima bikshu chishbonot rabim. God made man upright, but man searches for many different accounts. Okay, this is a chunk that needs to be sorted out. This is a little bit of a mess. What's going on here? So, to disappoint us all, I'm not going to address the question of this verse 26 with regards to women and a fate worse than death till we finish the first part of this chapter, which means that we're probably 2 weeks away from being able to address that verse properly. You're just going to have to trust me that it's not what it seems. We'll go back to the beginning. Okay. So first of all, let's deal with the big question. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of the text and without getting into verse by verse, because we'll get to that at a later point today. But just in a bird's eye view, if I took a giant step back, I'll scroll out. We have a whole picture. Right now you can't even see it because it's too small. But all right, if we took a giant bird's eye view of the whole chapter, who is speaking? That's the question. At least for the bulk of this chapter, we're going to divide it in half in a minute, but at least for the bulk of this chapter, who is speaking?
The wise men.
I think that's clear. The Chacham, the wise man, the philosopher, the one personality in Kohelet we haven't yet met, other than a brief reference to him at the beginning of the text. But we haven't encountered him or his philosophy or his attitude or what his says, what he says, but we do see his reference here. First of all, we see it in content. He talks about Tova chokhmah im nachala v'yoter shemesh. Wisdom is good with inheritance, but the advantage is to one who can see the sun. And we talked about the metaphor of the sun, light as wisdom, in the context of the, if you remember the opening paragraph of the sort of the metaphor of the four of the cycles of nature, we use that verse to describe the personality of the Chacham. And you see throughout this text a constant reference to Chacham. Lev Chachamim b'vet Evel, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The Ksil, the opposite of the Chacham, is the Ksil, is the fool. Right? Better to listen to the rebuke of the wise than to listen to the song of fools. Tov lishma gavat chacham ish shameh shir ksilim. This is a constant reference to the chacham, and you can see tovah chochma yitron da'at chochma techaya ba'aleha. The advantage is to knowledge that preserves the life of one who has it. It's a constant description of the one who praises wisdom. Now, there are some other variations in here. We'll have to get to it, but he certainly talks about wisdom in this is a stronghold for the wise man, better than 10 rulers in the city. That's sort of the identity card of the Chacham, right? That the wisdom is that which will preserve, save, and both himself and the world around him. So if that is the case, I think that is a foregone conclusion that this is the world of the Chacham. Having said that, however, I think it's also important to note that this is not, the whole chapter is not one speech. As we've seen many times, there are transition points. And those transition points tell us that we're dealing with a speaker up until a certain point. And I would argue that that transition point here is verse 23. In verse 23, Kohelet says, Kol zo nisiti b'chochma, amarti ech kama, bat v'hi rechaka mimeni. All this I have tested in wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it is far from me. Meaning he says, all of this was my attempt to understand the world and the philosophy and from a perspective of chochma, but I reject it because it's wrong. It's flawed. It's distant from me. Whatever that issue is, and we'll see it's in that context that he talks about the Isha. We'll come back to it another time. And so I would argue that the Chacham speaks from the beginning of this parak up to and including verse 22. Okay, so we're going to look at this parak from Pasuk Aleph through Chaf Bet, 1 to 22. And again, if you're following this class on your on the screen, that's fine. But if you have a Tanakh or if you have your own source of text that has Hebrew and English on it, it's always helpful because then you have a text in front of you, even if I don't show the whole text on the screen. Okay.
Rabbi, Pasuk 23, isn't it the Gemara talking about that he was talking about Para Aduma?
Okay, so yes, but again, if I start to interject all of the midrashim and the midrashic perspectives on each verse, we'll never get through it because Chazal took a very different approach midrashically to Kohelet, taking each verse out of context and giving it its own interpretation.
Thank you.
From a perspective of Tanakh, from a Pshat perspective, it's a hard approach to manage here. It works in other places, but not here. So there are lots of midrashic phrases that Chazal saw in one context. We're going to interpret them differently. Okay, so once I've identified the fact that this is now a new speaker, and you can kind of get a sense of it also in a new style. It
changes the tense.
It's changed tense. Correct. It's distant. It's philosophical. He's talking about. Here's his analysis of the world. It's third person. This is better than that. This is better than that. This is better than that. That's very Mishlei style. And there's a lot of comparisons and parallels between the Chacham of Kohelet and Mishlei. We'll talk about that at a later time as well. But that is essentially the context in which this chapter begins. Now, before we get into the content of what he's saying, I also want to make the observation that there's one key word that jumps off the page in this chapter. And I think it's clear, right? The word Tov. Tov Shem, Shem and Tov, Tov Lelachat Beit Evel, Tov Kas Mischok, Tov lishma gavat chacham, Tov acharit tava mereshito, Tov erech ruach mikva ruach, Tov achochma im nachala, b'yom tova hayeh betov, right? The word tov, it jumps off the page in pasuk Yelchet, Tov asher tochos b'zeh v'gam mizal tanach yadecha. He's dishing out advice. And when he's dishing out advice, he's assessing this is better than that. This is good advice. This is bad advice. And so his philosophical view, which is the Chacham, that's what the Chacham does. He analyzes the world and he offers advice. It comes to the conclusion of what is good in this world, Tov, whatever it is. We haven't gotten to the content yet. Just form, just the word Tov jumps off the page. I think it appears in this section 12 or 13 times in various formats. That is not an accident, because if you remember, the previous parak ended with the failure of the Amal. That was what we talked about last week. The failure of the Amal crashes and burns because he ends up adopting the philosophy of the Neheneh, and then that too fails, etc. The Amal wrote himself out of the script. But what was his final ending words, the Amal at the end of chapter 6? What was the last thing he said? Ki mi yodea ma tov la'adam b'chayim mispar yimei chayehev lo. Who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his life, which he spends like a shadow? Asher mi yagid la'adam ma yeh acharav. Who can tell man what will be in the future? So the Amal wrote himself out of the script by this question. Who knows what is good for man in his life? Next chapter begins, Tov, Shem, Mishem and Tov. You know what? I know what's good for man. I can tell you, this is good, this is not good, this is good, this is not good. 12 statements of this is good and this is not good, this is better than that. As if to say, to the question of what is good for man, Matov, and Mara, and what's bad, the Chacham comes up with an answer. Now, we can reject the answer, we can accept the answer, but in the end, you can see that chapter 7 is a direct response to chapter 6. I would even go further and suggest that that question of what is good for man was really the question with which the book began. Let's go back to the very beginning of the text, in chapter 2, where we talked about the combined efforts to understand the world. Right? I will come and I will test mirth and pleasure. No, sorry, verse 3. I took it all. I embraced it all. All of the experiences of this world. The experience of physical pleasure, wine, and the pleasures of the heart, the experience of intellectual pleasure, and you'll see Gdalti Masai, the builder. All three of those personalities, everybody except the Yirei Elokim, is included in this exercise. Ad asher ere eze tov livnei ha'adam asher yasu tachat hashamayim. Until I figure out what is good for man. And at the end of chapter 6, he fails, right? He says, what is good for man comes to the conclusion, mi yodea ma tov le'adam. Who knows? So that whole journey, right, of the personalities of the Chacham, in the first half you have the Amal and the Nehenatan, and the Yirei Elokim is a kind of a foil. The Amal fails. Comes along the Chacham and he answers both, in his mind, both the answer to the Amal in chapter 6 and the question with which the book began. Namely, what is good? Ma tov le'adam. 12 times the Chacham says, I know the answer to this question, because that's the Chacham. That's what he is, right? By definition, he's the philosopher, he's the wisdom. If you're looking for an understanding of the world, you turn to the philosopher, you turn to the Chacham. And so, Tov Shem, Tov Lechet, Tov Kas, Tov this, Tov that. That's the attitude of the Chacham. And right off the bat, we see the context of this text. Meaning, if we go back to the original presentation or introduction to Kohelet, we said that there were essentially two primary themes that the book of Kohelet struggles with and tries to navigate through. One is the meaning of good and evil, or good and bad, or Eitz Hadat Tov Vara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That was Shlomo HaMelech. And the other, of course, was the Eitz HaChaim, the life and death, and they interconnect with each other. What is the meaning of good in the shadow of the existence that is overpowered by death? Right? They are interconnected. So in the first half of the book, he struggled with primarily the themes of Tov and Ra. Comes along the Chacham and says, I've got this, Tov. What's his primary message? However, his primary message is to take the conclusions and draw them as far as the other variable that we're discussing is, namely, he's going to take us into the world of death and life and ask the question, what is the meaning of life and death, and how do we struggle with existence in the shadow of mortality? Tov lalechat bet evel, milechat bet mishteh, Tov Yom HaMavet Mivaldo. He's going to talk about the day of death versus the day of birth. He's going to talk about mourning versus mirth and feasting. He's going to talk about the house of mourning versus the house of celebration. Right? This is the theme that's going to drive the opening words of Kohelet. So we not only have we shifted from part 1 to part 2 of the book as a whole, but we've shifted our focus primarily from a focus on Tov and Ra, which are the two primary words of the first half of the book, to Chaim and Mavet, life and death, which are the two primary themes or words that are going to navigate us through or guide us through the second half of this text. So I share that with you as an introduction because it's always important to see the big picture. It's always important to see the forest. What's the issue that's vexing us all, even though we have 4 personalities and they're having a conversation amongst them, but they're having a conversation against the backdrop of 2 major questions, the Eitz Hadat and the Eitz HaChaim, and they will be with us throughout the text. Just to show you how far this goes, a kind of a little bit of an exercise here. I don't know if you can tell this on the screen, but can you all see that the first letter of this word is enlarged on the text? If you look at a regular Tanakh, current Tanakh, or any other Tanakh that is structured with a Masoretic style, you'll see that that's true. That's part of the Masorah, that this letter Tet, the beginning of chapter 7, is enlarged. It's as if to say this is a new unit. We already showed you last week that there was a paragraph break. Right? The only paragraph break in the text itself is between chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 7 also begins with an enlarged letter Tet. Now, why is that significant? Because jump to the end of the book. Okay? Jump to the very end of the book. Let's go to chapter 12. Remember, there's a preamble and a postscript that are not part of the original author of the text. So really the book ends, but I'm going to ignore that piece for now. Let's go to the very end of the book. What's the most famous verse in the whole text? What's the most famous pasuk in the whole book of Kohelet? Right. Parak Yud pasuk Yud Gimel. It's the one we read twice when we read it in Shul. Sof davar kol nishmat l'kim yirau mitzvotav shmor ki zeh kol adam. This is the end of the matter, or after all has been heard, sof davar, conclusion. After all the arguments have been heard, kol nishma, the conclusion is, et l'kim yirau mitzvotav shmor ki zeh kol adam. God, fear God, keep his commandments. That is the duty. That is the whole duty of man. That is the whole of man. In other words, Kohelet has a very clear conclusion. After all the navigating the vicissitudes of the arguments and the back and forth, Kohelet has a conclusion. And that conclusion is fear God. So we have a winner in this debate. Right? We have 4 personalities, but we have a clear winner. We may not necessarily agree that he's the winner, but the author certainly did. But notice the beginning of this pasuk. You see the large letter Samach? There are only 2 verses in Kohelet that have an enlarged letter at the beginning of the word. Beginning of chapter 7, Tov, etc., and the end, the conclusion in Perek Bet. Now, that may or may not be connected. I don't really have a way of proving that, but I do have an observation about the connection between this moment in the text and our chapter. Because this moment in the text says, Sof Davar, this is the end of the matter after all that's been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments, because that is the totality of man, Kizek Kol Ha'adam. Interestingly, what is the beginning of our chapter? What is how does the pasuk bet? How does it read? Tov lalechat al beit evel milechat al beit mishteh basher hu sof kol adam. Better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for that is the end of every man. So if I do a little bit of play with words, which sometimes I like to do, and I kind of look at Sof, Kol Ha'adam, as the beginning of chapter 7 and the end of chapter 13 as a kind of a phrase that links both ends of the story, then you end up with this, okay? If I look at these two verses side by side, and I didn't put translations on this source page because the translations we'll get to first. This is just to play with structure. This page is just a little bit of playing with structure. I think it was helpful sometimes to understand, we're so used to reading a text as a linear text, but poetry in Tanakh was not meant to be written and to be read or learnt in a linear fashion. If you've ever studied Tehillim, you know that Tehillim is a song, and therefore it's meant to be sung. And there are lines that are meant to be a chorus line and repeat themselves after every phrase, etc. Goes back and forth. There's many ways to read poetry in Tanakh in a non-linear fashion, in a more poetic style. And I think this is one of those moments where he starts with Tov Lelechat Beit Evel. It's good to go to a house of mourning rather than to a house of feasting, because that is Sof Kol Adam. And then he uses that same phrase to bracket his conclusions. Sof Davar Kol Nishma, and the end of all that is said, fear God and keep his commandments, Kizek Kol Adam. It's almost as if, and this is a little game I played, right? It's almost as if I took the opening phrase of chapter 7, Tov lechat beit eva milechat beit mishteh basher hu sof kol ha'adam, and transitioned it into the end of the book, Sof davar kol nishmat elokim yom mitzotav shmo kizeh kol ha'adam. And you have this very neat kind of structure that takes us from his opening quest to understand life and death and what it means to his conclusion, which is that the solution to understanding life and death lies in our commitment to the values of the Yirei Elokim. It's a long way to get there, but this opening and closing kind of structure kind of opens that window and says, okay, here's where it starts, but here's where it's going to end. And the key is to understand the two ways to read this phrase. Sof kol adam can mean that is the end of every man, death, and therefore we are challenged by death. And sof davar, at the end of all of the conversation and all the opinions, the totality of man can be summed up in the declaration of the Yirei Elokim, et mitzvotav shemo, et Elokim yirau mitzvotav shemo. Fear God, keep his commandments. So that's just a kind of an observation that there is much more going on in this text than just words. There's a lot of structure. And part of our challenge is to be able to read the structure as well as the content. All right.
Rabbi, also the two letters that were chosen to show both, Tet is open on the top, Samech is complete closed. So it gives us a chance to see the light and to continue with life.
That's very good. It's true. I don't know what version of the Hebrew script Shlomo Melech used when he wrote it, so I can't really speak to that, but that is certainly in our block script, that is true. Okay.
Didn't you indicate that the last paragraph of Kohelet was written by or added, and it might not have been Shlomo's words? So
There's a possibility that the conclusion and the opening, the introduction as well, the parable, but even if they are, and I bring this back to what I said before, even if they are written kind of by the Chizkiyahu and the editors of Kohelet, they did so with an understanding that they integrate into the text itself. They didn't do so as a separate, okay, the text is negative, we're going to add this as a postscript because it gives us a positive conclusion, right? That I reject. All I said was that Kohelet is written in first person, Ani Kohelet. The conclusion here is Haya Kohelet Chacham. The Kohelet is written in third person. So there's a conclusion and an opening that's an addendum that was written probably in the time of the Chizkiyahu when the Tanakh was re-edited. However, they are integrated into the text in such a way that they're holistic to the themes of the text itself. So even if they were written kind of pulling, at a different time, from a textual meaning perspective, I don't think that that's a significant issue. I think they're still pulling the same themes, and the same way the four parables of the cycles of nature with which the text began in chapter 1, you see it integrated throughout the entire book, because all they did was they took the themes of the text and they kind of built a preamble to it. So it's the same idea here. All right, let's go back to where we're at. So we're assuming now from chapter 7, we're assuming from verse 1 through verse 22. I want to make that clear. We are going to be looking at everything up to and including Pasuk Chav Bet. And we're going to leave Chav Gimel to the end, to another time, another conversation. We'll get there. Who is speaking now? We know it's the Chacham. But the bigger question is, A, what is he saying? And B, who is he speaking to? Because at this point of the text, nobody is presenting a perspective that's in a vacuum, right? He's responding to the question asked by the Amal at the end of chapter 6. He's responding to the question we asked at the beginning of chapter the beginning of chapter 3. He's responding to, or chapter 2, he's responding to the themes of the text. So who is he responding to is as much a key to understand his message as the content itself. So let's break it down and first answer that question. And also, is there a structure? Is he talking to one person in one part of the text and talking to another person in another part of the text? So let's see. So my next question that we're going to ask is not necessarily what he's saying, but who is he speaking to? You follow where I'm going? We haven't gotten well, hang on a second. We haven't gotten to to what he's saying. We're just right now looking at who is he responding to. So let's work it through. Tov Shem Mishem Tov. Good name is better than good oil. What that oil is, we'll talk about. It's a complicated phrase and complicated imagery, but it has a very clear interpretation. We'll get to that issue. But Tov Shem Mishem Tov, good name better than good oil. V'yom Hamavet miyom Yivaldo, day of death better than the day of one's birth. Tov alecha bet ever milecha bet mishteh b'asher sof kol adam. Better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for that is the end of every man. And the living take it to heart. V'chai yiten al libo. Tov kas mischok. Sorrow is better than laughter. Kibero apanim mitavlev. By sadness, the sadness of the face, the heart is made good. Lev chachamim bevet evel. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. Lev ksilim bevet simcha. The heart of the fool is in the house of mirth and celebration. Tov lishmo ga'arat chacham meish shomer shir ksilim. Better to rebuke the wise, hear the rebuke of wise, than to hear the song of fools. The crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool, which is vanity. Extortion makes the wise foolish. Bribe destroys the understanding. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. Patience is better than proud spirit. Don't be angry. Has anybody sensed that there's a new theme going on here, that we've changed themes, changed subjects? Don't say what was is better than what is. That's not a question of wisdom. Wisdom is better with inheritance. But if you had to choose one or the other, I would rather choose seeing the sun or wisdom. Are we still talking?
Positive to negative, or active to passive, or active to passive.
Go back to, okay, maybe. I think I want to specifically stay in the language of Kohelet that we have created up until this point. There are three possibilities. He could be talking to the Neheneh, he could be talking to the Amal, he could be talking to the Chacham, to the Arei Elokim. So to whom is he speaking when he says, hear me out, to whom is he speaking when he says, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting? To whom is he speaking? That's the only question I'm asking. To whom is he speaking when he says it is better to feel the sorrow and sadness of a house of mourning than the celebration and the mirth and the schok and the mishteh of the house of feasting?
To the Amal. He speaks to the Amal.
No, the Natan.
The Amal, we'll get to the Amal. But the Natan was all about feasting and joy, and we're in this world to enjoy it. We're in this world for the feasting, for the achilah, for the shtiyah, for the simcha. Those three themes: eating, drinking, and enjoying the world with the card, with the stamp of the identity card of the Nehenatan. And for the Chacham to turn and say, it is better. You want to spend your life in the house of feasting. Why don't you go take a look at what goes on in the house of mourning? Much more realistic picture of the world if you spend a day in a shiva house than if you spend your day in a feast of and celebration. Right? That's exactly what he says. And in that context, the ksil, the fool, who is the opposite of the chacham, is here a reference to the nehenatan, the one who spends his life in the Beit Simcha, in the house of celebration, rather than in a place where there is meaning, where there is thought, where there's a chayit, where the living take it to heart. Right? That is a direct attack against the world of the nehenatan. Now, having said that, take a look at Pasuk Chet. Pasuk Chet is misleading. Because Tov acharit davar mireshito, better the end of a thing than its beginning, right? That phrase is a direct parallel to the opening of the sentence of Pasuk Aleph. Tov shem mishem and tov, I still have to explain. Tov yom hamavet miyom yivaldo. Day of death is better than the day of living for the reason of day of birth, for the reason that he's just described. In other words, if in terms of understanding the world, I will get more out of perception of the existence of death and mortality, what it means to me and how I live my life by going to the Beit Eiffel, by going to the house of mourning. Right? Tov acharit davar. Davar means the end of a thing or the future of a thing. From its beginning, mereshito is a direct parallel to Yom HaMavet Miyom Yivaldo. Whereas Tov erech ruach migvar ruach, better a spirit of patience than spirit of arrogance. Arrogance leads us into the conversation about anger. Don't be so angry. Anger is less in the bosom of fools. Anger is not the card, not the identity card of the Nehenatan. Anger, frustration, and frustration being a function of expectations because his expectations are higher, is the calling card of the Amal. And so what happens in Pasuk Chet is he transitions from one to the other. There's a hint to that. It's the only one of these phrases where he repeats the word Tov. Tov, A of B. Tov, A of B. Tov, Achmit Reshito. New concept. Tov, Erech Ruach, Migvar Ruach. I'll sort this out for you in the structure in a second, but you'll see it. So at that point, the moment he starts talking about anger and arrogance, now he's talking to the Amal. And you can see it in the themes that he addresses in the next series of psukim. Don't be hasty to be angry. Anger it rests in the bosom of fools. Don't go and say, oh, the good old days when we were right. Those days were better than these. That's not a question. That's not a question asked by the wise. Here he talks about inheritance. Inheritance, wealth, and wisdom can go together. That's a good thing. But yoter, the yitaron, the advantage, if you had to choose between inheritance and chokhmah, the advantage would be to the one who chooses to see the sun or to see wisdom or to the chacham. And so he addresses the amal, the one who is focused on the inheritance on the nachla, and then he says, but wait a second, but chokhmah is more important. Here he has kesef, tzela chokhmah b'tzela kesef, right? The amal is building, the amal is amassing, the amal is trying to achieve something with all the kesef in the world. But ultimately it's about the wisdom that can preserve the one who has it. Gimel and Yudalid again gets into the same issue, a little more subtle, and we'll unpack it in our next kind of go around with it. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight that which he has made crooked? What is it that God made crooked that we are trying to make straight? That's an open question. I'll leave that. You can already guess what the answer is going to be. B'yom tovah yeh b'tov. In a day of prosperity, be good. Uv'yom ra'ah, and in the day of calamity, right? Consider this. God has made them both, side by side, to the end that man cannot find anything after him. Whatever that means. Unclear what that means. But we'll unpack it. But all of that is to the Amal. And all of that is to the one personality in Kohelet who is obsessed with mortality, because that's what the Amal is. He's obsessed with the fact that he cannot live forever. That's all he wants to do, is to impact his enduring legacy forever. And the Chacham says to him, that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen. All right, Pasuk Tedvav. If up until now we've had his address to the Nanatan, and we've had his address to the Amal, I can only imagine who's left. There's only 1 out of 3 left, right? So now is left to the Yerakim. And Pasuk Tetzayin, he starts his diatribe against the Yerakim, who is all about being righteous and good and coming to the temple and being and subjecting yourself to God's laws. Says the Chacham, Al titzadik harbe, al titchakam yoter, don't be so righteous, don't be overly wise, overly righteous. Why should you destroy yourself? Al tirsha harbe, don't be so wicked, don't be so foolish. Why should you die young? A little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of goodness, a little bit of wickedness. That's the way to be the real God-fearer. A little bit of, kind of just chill. A little bit of this and a little bit of that. Just chill. It's the identity card of the Chacham. Wisdom is a stronghold for the wise man. You want to be righteous? There's nobody on this world, there's nobody on this planet who can claim that they are all righteous and never sin. So why? Don't take heed to all the words that are spoken, lest you hear your servant curse you. You yourself know that you've cursed others too. What that means, again, there's a kind of there are pieces of this that need a much deeper analysis. But these are clearly a rebuke of the Elokim, as if to say, Elokim, you're just going to either die, you don't want to be wicked, then crime doesn't pay. You take a life of wickedness, that's the way of the fool, but don't be so righteous. Just don't, Okay. So more or less, I have three speeches wrapped in one. And that's the key that I wanted us to understand. I have three separate speeches all wrapped in one. The Chacham is speaking, and he's addressing each one of the other personalities in the text. Now, there's a common thread behind all three of them, and as next week we're going to unpack it in detail, but you can already begin to sense the philosophical worldview of the Chacham, which, again, I'm not going to spell it out because we have to unpack a little bit more to see it, but this is his address to each one of these in turn. And so in this, if I go back to the source page that I shared with you, what I've done in the remaining part of this page is I've taken the text and laid it out again in what I think is a structural layout. The opening of the Chacham's words to the Ne'anatan reads almost like Tehillim or Mishlei. And that's not an accident. There's a pattern there. The pattern is essentially take the entire text and divide it into two columns. You have column A, and this only works for the first 8 psukim, but I want you to see it. You have column A and column B. And in between, I have a couple of additional phrases that are more explanatory, internal to the text. Meaning, he's talking about that which is good over that which is less good. The right column is that which is better, Tov, A from B. You all see that? Tov Shem, that name is better. It's often translated as a good name, but that's not what it means, right? Tov Shem, a name is better than good oil. Shem and Tov. Yom HaMavet, the day of death, referring to the house of mourning, we'll get to in a second. That Tov carries through, is better than Miyom Yivaldo. There's a parallel there. Tov lelecha to Beit Evel, it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Now you'll ask why. So this why really goes on the whole opening 3 lines. Because to really understand life, you need to recognize that is the end of every person. You cannot ignore that perspective. You cannot ignore that world, the fact that man is mortal. Then he goes on, Tov Kas Mischok, and again he translates, I think this translation is correct. Here Kas means something. What happened? No. Here Kas means something else than it does in the next paragraph. Here I think it's more about sorrow, pain. Tov Kas Mischok, sorrow is better than laughter. Because for the same reason that when one experiences sadness and countenance, then they take it to heart and they improve and they understand life better and more powerfully than just enjoying the ride. Remember, the Ne'anatan was the one whose conclusion was enjoy the ride, like an animal and instincts, just enjoy the ride. Says the Chacham, you can't live that way. Lev Chachamim b'veit Evel. A wise person understands what it means to go to a house of mourning. A fool spends his life only in the house of feasting. Lev ksilim b'veit simcha. Tov lishmo gavat chacham. Again, there's that tov on the right side. So good to hear the rebuke of the wise, then to hear the song of the fool. And then again, an explanation. The song of the fool, shir ksilim, what does that mean? Is the words of the fool, the words of the Ne'anatan, and he constantly refers to the Ne'anatan as a fool. Kol hasir is like the sound of thorns. Kol hasirim tachat asir. They are like the sound of thorns crackling over a fire. Kein schok aksil. If you've ever made a bonfire, or a cooking fire, you know that if you use thorns or thin wood to make a fire, it lights very quickly, and it can make a very big fire very quickly, but it goes out very quickly as well. It doesn't last very long. Whereas a fire made from a strong log of wood is much quieter, but much more long lasting. So there's that element here. Kol hasirim tachat asir. If you're cooking over this is again that alliteration, cooking in a pot over a fire made of sirim, meaning thorns, then that is like the laughter of the fool. It's loud, but it's irrelevant. It's not lasting. It has no meaning, right? And then the last line, Tov acharit davar mireshito, is an exact parallel to where we began. Tov shem mishem and tov yom hamavet miyom hivaldo. The end versus the beginning. So his structure is all this is to the words of the Nehenatan. And essentially what he says to the Nehenatan is you embraced life with the perspective of, with the attitude of, we're just going to enjoy the ride. That is a meaningless existence. That is an existence of the ksil, of the fool. And the contrast to it is, if you want to understand this world, you have to stare death in the face. You have to walk into a house of mourning, and you have to understand that life is mortal, and life is too short to waste it in shir and simcha and the sound of thorns under a fire.
No.
Hang on a second. I just need to. And to waste it under a fire. So that's the message of the Nehenatan to the Chacham to the Nehenatan. The only thing I will add to that is this reference to, I promise you a discussion of this reference of Shemen. How does Tov Shem, Shemen Tov, and Yom HaMavet, Yom HaValdo fit together? So we just have to understand the imagery. The oil that he's referring to here is not just perfume and oil, and it might be, right? It might be the oils of perfumes that are used into kind of the schok, the laughter, and the Beit Mishteh. That's possible. But given that Pasuk Aleph is talking about the day of birth, I think he's talking about something else. I think he's talking about the oil with which you smear over a newborn baby in order to smooth out the skin as they are born, which is a direct reference to Yechezkel. In Yechezkel, or you see this reference in Yechezkel, Yechezkel has a very powerful image we talk about at Pesach night at the Seder, where he talks about Israel as a newborn child cast away in the field. And God finds this newborn baby, Moladatayich b'yom uledat on your day of your birth, you were like a child cast away in the field, abandoned. Nobody wanted you. You were not washed to clean you. You were not salted. You were not swaddled, and therefore you were weltering in your own blood. So God says, I took you and I cared for you and I washed you and I provided for you and I entered a brit with you. I washed you in water. I washed away the blood from your skin. And I anointed you in oil. Because that was the practice with a newborn baby. You anointed them in oil. You smeared them with oil in order to soften the skin. That's what KOHELET is referring to. So when he says Tov Shem, the name that he's referring to is, this I think is correctly interpreted by the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the name that he's talking about is the name we achieve in our lifetime, right? The name we leave behind in the world, the legacy, the reputation, the eulogy of the Yom HaMavet and the Beit Evel all go together. The Shem, the Mavet, the Beit Evel, right, is the legacy, the reputation a person has. That is what you feel, what you learn about in a house of mourning, whereas in the day of birth, Yom HaValdo, and the Beit Mishteh, and the Shemen and the Schok is all childish. It's all the meaningless noise and crackling of the thorns of a life embraced in the here and now without recognizing that there is a future that is mortal, that is limited, that is time limited. And so you can't waste it away in the world of the schok or the mishteh. That's his message to the Ne'anatan. So to summarize his message to the Ne'anatan, he takes the very foundation of the Ne'anatan, which is embrace this world because that's all there is, and we're going to ignore death in any mortality in any way. We're just going to go for the ride. Says the Chacham to him, go spend a day in a house of mourning, and you will realize that you can't do that. Go pay a shiva call. Go visit the families of Chayalim who fell in Gaza. And tell me that you can spend the rest of your life enjoying the ride.
I think
It doesn't work.
I think the thinking of the Nehanatan does accept mortality. It just has a different answer. Yes, life is short. We know we're going to die. And the enjoyment is an antidote or rejection of the sadness. We're here for a limited time, so let's enjoy the time that we're here.
Maybe, but he hasn't said that, and we will yet get to the response of the Ne'anatan to the Chacham. We haven't heard the last of the Ne'anatan. And what I will do at the end of this unit, which will be next week, is after we kind of trace through the themes of each one of his presentations, we'll find a common thread that will define the philosophy of the Chacham. There's a certain approach that he's taking in his rebuke of each of them. They will respond. They will respond either in substance, like you're suggesting for the Ne'anatan, or they will respond in utter rejection of the Chacham because he's worse than the Rasha, much like the Yerei Elokim who will say to the Chacham, I'm not interested in the product you have to sell. So I'm going to actually stop sharing because I don't need the rest of this. We're going to sort this out. But I wanted us to see the beginning of the forest here and see the structure. So just to summarize, and we're going to conclude here, we're looking at the first introductory perspective of the philosopher, the Chacham. We have yet to define what makes the philosopher, so that's still on our agenda. He turns his focus to the question of mortality much more than good and evil. So that's introduces us to the second half of the text. And he begins to challenge each of the main personalities we have encountered so far. The Ne'anatan, whose perspective was characterized by simcha, eating and drinking, he challenges. And he says, I'd rather spend my day visiting shiva houses. Why? Because then I realize I understand what mortality is about. To the Yerei Elokim, we haven't gotten there yet. He will talk about not will talk about not being too righteous, right? Not being too overly committed to righteousness, and to the Amal, he will talk about anger and arrogance and how they relate to each other. So we'll sort that out and what that means, Bezrat Hashem, next week. But I wanted us to see the structure of those. Who is he talking to in each section, as well as to recognize that his words themselves are also structured in such a way that we can kind of play out the text much like we would in Mishlei or in Tehillim. And with that, we're a few minutes late, so I will stop here. And if you have any questions, please put them. I hope you've put them in the chat. I will save the chat, and that way I can look at them and try to address them next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.